If you've ever read Mark Devlin's books, Musical Truth, Volume 1 to 3, you probably know you never listen to music in the same light again. He's been fascinated for years. We're trying to get to the hidden messages that are all around us, but he fights for truth in so many ways, in very admirable ways. But we're going to hear a slightly different side to things today, because James Bond is so rooted in the collective psyche, and it's highly entertaining in many ways, but maybe there's a bit more to it than we knew, and some more shadowy areas, because it's telling us things that we don't even know we're being told. And we're going to hear a lot more today about mind control in James Bond movies. So please, Mark Devlin.
Thanks very much. Hello, folks. It's good to be back. This is my third symposium speaking, and I've been to a few as a punter as well. Big thanks to Andy for the invitation, and also he was the guy that first put me on as a public speaker back in 2013. My very first talk, I was shitting myself all day before it, but about 10 minutes into it, I found I was going with the flow, and there's been no stopping since. So this is my career now. So the content today, as you've heard, is going to be slightly different to what I normally talk about. I've always been a fan of James Bond. I was into the novels as a young lad. When you're about 13, 14 years of age, when you come across books that are full of sex and violence, you know, it's full of appeal to you. So there was this small contingent of lads at my school that were into the James Bond books. And then later I got into the films, which are actually very different to the books, but we find the same elements present throughout. And I can remember when I would watch James Bond movies on a Sunday evening. ITV often used to put them on a Sunday in the 80s. And then I would go to school on Monday morning trying to act like James Bond. I would try and put down the school bullies in the same way that Bond put down the villains. And I would try and get the girls in the same way that James Bond got the girls. But I failed miserably at both. But it's a reminder of just how movies can affect our mindset and even our behaviors and make us very responsive to them. So let's have a look at some elements of the character of James Bond and also his creator, Ian Fleming. So here he is, Ian Lancaster Fleming, born on the 28th of May 1908 in Mayfair, London, to a very wealthy aristocratic family of Scottish ancestry. This was Fleming's father, Valentine Flemming, killed in action in the First World War on the Western Front. And Fleming's grandfather was Robert Flemming, who presided over a banking dynasty. And this is the latest incarnation of it, Stonehenge Fleming. Talks about the heritage dating back to 1873 and a sixth-generation family at our core. So very much rooted in the world of banking and finance. Ian Fleming's brother, Peter, was a very prolific travel writer, and he was married to the actress Celia Johnson, who we see here, who was the star of Brief Encounter and many other films. And Ian, in many ways, operated in his older brother's shadow. He was reportedly always trying to impress his mother in the same way that Peter had, and was always trying to aspire to his achievements. And it found him some way to sort of find his course in life. So Ian Fleming attended Eton College, where so many of the rich and famous and so-called great and good of our society do. And after that, he went to Sandhurst Military College, and he gave James Bond this very same background. The character of James Bond reflects Fleming himself in so many ways. It's very autobiographical. So Bond is said to have attended Sandhurst in the same way. This was Ian Fleming's mother, Evelyn, and after the death of Ian's father, she became very much a strong matriarchal figure in the family and tried to guide Ian into various career paths. So he spent a period trying to be a stockbroker, didn't work well, he didn't take to that profession. He also spent some time as a journalist for the Reuters news agency, which I gather these days is owned by those nice people, the Rothschilds. And he had various overseas assignments, including in Moscow, covering the trial of a group of alleged spies. So that was his earliest forays into the world of espionage. This is Muriel Wright, who is one of Ian Fleming's girlfriends. He was a wild womanizer, and he attended university in Munich and Geneva, but he also spent some time living in Austria. And while he was skiing in the Austrian Alps, he met this woman, Muriel Wright, and started a relationship with her, but this broke up due to Fleming's womanizing. And then Muriel Wright was later killed during an airstrike in the Second World War in 1944. But she seemingly served as a prototype for the Bond girl that he later put into the James Bond novels. Many of the characters that we find in those books are said to have been modelled on her. Is it working now? Okay. Microphone switch. So here we find Fleming getting into the world of military intelligence for the first time, and his experiences in this role very much shaped the later James Bond stories. So during the First World War, Fleming was 31 when this started. He got drafted into the Naval Office, the intelligence wing of the Royal Navy, and he served under this individual, Admiral John Godfrey, who was, by all accounts, a cantankerous old sod, and he used Fleming as a sort of envoy, a go-between with various other divisions that he needed to work with, because Fleming was more diplomatic. Fleming really took to this role, and he seemed to have found his true life path. So he remained in that role throughout the Second World War. One of the assets that was said to have been used by British military intelligence during the Second World War years was this individual, who always seems to crop up in my talks. I don't know what it is. I find it very interesting because I look at numbers. I love numbers. I love synchronicity with numbers. And the start time for my talk today was 12:10, as in 12th of October. And the 12th of October was the birthday of ALISTAIR CROWLEY. You couldn't make it up. Anyway, Crowley was recruited as an asset of British military intelligence, and he worked alongside Ian Fleming, reportedly, to the point that some researchers claim that Fleming served as his handler during these roles. In this book, Richard B. Spence talks about the connections between the world of military intelligence and the world of the dark occult. There do seem to be a lot of overlap there. And in my music industry talks, we find the very same elements. We find mind control, which is present throughout this story, social engineering agendas, the world of the dark occult, aspects of military intelligence. The only thing that's missing from this story that's usually present in the music industry is pedophilia, rather happily. I guess that's a good thing, right? So one of the operations that Crowley was reportedly involved with concerned Rudolf Hess, this high-ranking Nazi official who famously took a flight into Scotland in 1941 on a solo mission where he claimed he was trying to broker some sort of peace deal between Britain and Germany. And he was captured and interrogated, and according to various researchers, Crowley was involved in the process of interrogating Rudolf Hess at the behest of the department which Ian Fleming worked for. And Crowley seemed to have had quite an effect on Fleming during the brief time that he knew him. Crowley died in 1947, shortly after the Second World War. But he seems to have shaped the very first James Bond villain, who went by the name of Le Chiffre, French for the cipher or the number. This was in Casino Royale, the first Bond novel, which we'll come on to. And so here we have Crowley, and what we've got on the right is an artist's interpretation of what Le Chiffre looked like based on how Fleming described him in the novel. And there are some physical similarities there. And so Crowley seems to have served as an archetype for that first Bond villain and probably many others, including the figure of Blofeld, who we'll get onto as well. And from this Wikipedia extract, we find that Fleming worked with Wild Bill Donovan, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's special representative on intelligence, basically in the creation of the Office of the Coordinator of Information, the department that turned into the Office of Strategic Services, aka the OSS, which was the forerunner of the CIA. So Ian Flemming seems to have been responsible, involved in the creation of that agency, which might explain why the CIA figures so strongly in the James Bond stories, and particularly the figure of Felix Leiter, the CIA agent who served as Bond's ally in many of the books and films. He's been portrayed many times over the years. For some reason, they never bother using the same actor. So this is what Felix Leiter has looked like in the various films over the years. Another well-known British author who was also an asset of the Intel services was Roald Dahl, of Tales of the Unexpected fame and so much more. And Roald Dahl, there's lots of synchronistic overlap here as we go all over the place, was involved in writing the screenplay for the movie version of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang about this magical flying car. And the original story was written by Ian Flemming. It was one of his rare diversions from the James Bond novels when he put out this story, which was written for his young son. And the screenplay for it, which was made into a movie in 1967, was written by Roald Dahl, co-written by Roald Dahl. And that's where we got the introduction of the character of the child catcher. Deeply sinister, deeply unsettling. I said there weren't any pedophilic elements to this, but maybe there are, that I forgot. So Roald Dahl introduced the child catcher character. He wasn't there in the original book. We've got some tie-ins here to the London 2012 Olympics opening ceremony, which was an occult ritual absolutely steeped in symbolism. We had Russell Brand, you know, that consciousness warrior, that truther hero, playing the part of the child catcher within that ritual. And some further overlap back into James Bond from that event came from Daniel Craig appearing with the Queen in a sequence specially filmed for that ceremony. So the London 2012 Olympics opening ceremony was all about British icons and parts of British culture. And so James Bond had been firmly instilled within the British psyche as a mainstay of our culture in this land. And you just don't get to that position. No character gets to that status unless they're serving various agendas and unless they're doing the bidding of the control system that we've got. It just doesn't happen. So it's very clear that the whole character of James Bond from his earliest incarnation was being used to push various agendas. Another author involved in intelligence circles, also as an asset for the British Intel services, was Dennis Wheatley, who was the writer of various occult stories. So we're getting back into the world of the dark occult here. One of his best-known stories was The Devil Rides Out, which was made into a movie in the late 60s, and we had the character of Makata, the high priest of this ritualistic mystery school. And his character was said to have been modelled very strongly on the aforementioned ALISTAIR Crowley. So Makata was played by Charles Gray, who later cropped up in 2 James Bond movies, You Only Live Twice in a brief role, and in Diamonds Are Forever, where he portrayed Blofeld. Also in The Devil Rides Out was Christopher Lee, who was the adversary of Makata in the story. And it turns out that Christopher Lee is a cousin or a step-cousin of Ian Flemming. So we've got a tie back into the Flemming family here. And so we get on to the creation of the James Bond novels. So these came relatively late in Ian Flemming's life. He put out the first novel, Casino Royale, in 1952. And this was said to have been detracting from the trauma, as he describes it, of his marriage, his first marriage, to this woman, Anne Charteris. He said getting married at the age of 42 was quite a shock to his system, so to divert himself away from it, he started the writing of these novels and created the character of James Bond. And James Bond was very autobiographical to Flemming. He had the same habits, the same idiosyncrasies. He smoked the same brands of cigarettes as Flemming. He wore the same types of shirts. He enjoyed eating the same sort of breakfast. And the famous vodka martini that we see in all the James Bond movies was a favourite drink of Flemming's as well. So this woman, Anne Charteris, was married to Lord Rothermere, the proprietor of the Daily Express, And then she began an affair with Flemming, and this led to her getting divorced from Lord Rothermere and eventually getting married to Flemming. And these two had a son together, Caspar, a very tragic figure. So he died at the age of 23 in 1975 on Ian Flemming's birthday, 12th of August. Committed suicide. He had a very sad life. He was an alcoholic and a drug addict and a depressive. And that's the tragic story of Ian Flemming's only offspring. This is Ian Flemming's house in Jamaica. Harking back to the British colonial days in the Caribbean, Jamaica was a favourite hangout spot for Flemming. He spent much of his time there. This was the house that he had specially built called GoldenEye, which later became the title of one of the James Bond films. And GoldenEye was also the title of one of the intelligence operations that Flemming was involved in during the Second World War, all to do with espionage activities in Spain, working out of Gibraltar. So Flemming used GoldenEye as the spot for the writing of his various novels. And he had a habit where he would go there in January of each year, and he would write a book from January to March, and then in the spring he would come back to London, that book would be published, and then the following year he would repeat the cycle. And he did that from 1952 all the way through to his death in 1964. He died at the age of 56 on a golf course in Kent after suffering a heart attack. And his health had been suffering for quite some time before that. He was a heavy smoker, heavy drinker, and heavy womanizer. In terms of the inspiration for James Bond, incidentally, just before we move on from this, before I forget, this house, and specifically the desk at which Flemming wrote the James Bond novels, was the place where Sting, just going back into my music industry stuff for a minute, wrote the song Every Breath You Take for the Police. And that song is not a love song. That song is about a creepy stalker surveilling his prey. So it seems appropriate that Sting would have written that song at the same desk that Ian Flemming wrote the James Bond stories, just as an aside there. So where did the original James Bond come from? Well, Flemming got the name from this book, which sat on his coffee table in GoldenEye in Jamaica, Birds of the West Indies, by an author who went by the name of James Bond. And this is what he looked like. You ready? Not really everyone's image of James Bond, but this was the original guy from whom Flemming took the name. In this interview that he did in GoldenEye, Flemming spoke of how he went so far in terms of revealing great secrets regarding missions that he himself had been involved with, but he couldn't go much further because if he overstepped the mark, he'd be in breach of the Official Secrets Act and he would get jailed for it. So there's some truth in the James Bond books, but we don't get the whole truth. This is one of the women with whom Flemming had an affair while he was living in Jamaica. She went by the name of Blanche Blackwell, and she came from another wealthy British aristocratic family responsible for the Cross and Blackwell brand of baked beans and other foods. And also she's the mother of Chris Blackwell, who was the proprietor of Island Records in Jamaica. Island Records was the label that Bob Marley's material was released on, along with many other prolific reggae artists. So there's another connection there back into music. In terms of where James Bond got his 007 moniker from, well, this goes all the way back to the era of Queen Elizabeth I. And within her circle, she had an occultist by the name of John Dee. And he went by the name of 007, the code name. And according to this article, John Dee would often write letters to the Queen, and he would sign off with this symbol here, which looks very similar to 007, and it meant for your eyes only, which also became the title of a later James Bond story. Also, we seem to have a tie-in to this biblical character by the name of Tubal-Cain, and there's a bit of wordplay going on here because it relates to two balls and a cane, basically. Some sort of phallic stuff going on there. But the way Tubal-Cain is represented was with this sort of staff type design here and the two balls. And it's been pointed out that this is very similar to the logo that we now have coming through Facebook. So there seems to be a tie-in there. But that's where 007 came from. It goes all the way back to the days of Queen Elizabeth I and the espionage of the times, because that was all about spying. Reportedly, it also involved remote viewing all those centuries ago, tying into what Todd was talking about last evening. The character of James Bond, although it was based very much on Flemming himself, also seems to have been influenced by this character, Sir Fitzroy MacLean, who was a Second World War hero. He was one of only 2 soldiers during the war who rose from the rank of private all the way up to brigadier during those years. The other one was Enoch Powell, MP. And another figure on whom the character of Bond seems to have been based was Hoagy Carmichael, an American actor and singer. So here's an artist's impression of how James Bond looked from the way Flemming describes him in the novels, and that's Hoagy Carmichael. So Flemming himself, in this statement, which becomes very interesting because it's very different to how Bond is portrayed in the films, said, "I didn't intend for Bond to be likable. He's a blunt instrument in the hands of government. He's got vices and few perceptible virtues." And this is far more getting down to the crux of what James Bond really represents than what we get from the movies. So the movies reinforce the idea of Bond as a hero. He's fighting for the good of humanity. He's taken on all these dastardly villains, and he represents us. He's on our side. Whereas the truth of the matter is a complete inversion of that. James Bond is an order follower. He takes orders from those perceived to be of a higher rank than him, and he goes out and kills people on somebody else's say-so, without judging for himself whether this is a justifiable action. That's a very bad place to be in, spiritually and karmically, to be an order follower in that way. And we know that the intelligence services and the aspects of the establishment control system that they represent are unfortunately steeped in activities such as Satanism, pedophilia, and certainly lies, deception, and propaganda. So any agent that goes out there representing these values and doing the bidding of these systems is not a good person, is not a moral person. And that's been a difficult thing for me to come to terms with, because I always thought of James Bond as a hero when I was a lad. That's how you're supposed to think of him. But it's not what he really is. And we're getting some way to the truth of his character in this comment from Flemming here. And so we get on to the movies and the various actors that have portrayed James Bond through the years. And if I asked you, who was the first actor to portray James Bond on screen, most of you would probably say Sean Connery, right? Any other answers? David Niven was later. That was in Casino Royale. No, Lazenby was later as well. It was an obscure American actor. And here he is. Who's seen The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's film? Yeah? You might remember the manager of the Overlook Hotel, Mr. Ullman, was portrayed by an American actor by the name of Barry Nelson. And he was the first individual to portray James Bond on screen. It was part of an American TV series which first aired in 1954 called Climax. It was based on Fleming's novel Casino Royale, which had come out a couple of years earlier, and it starred Barry Nelson as not a British Secret Service agent, but a CIA operative by the name of Jimmy Bond. So here he is, and the very first James Bond villain, Le Chiffre, was played here by the American actor Peter Lorre. So this predated the first James Bond film, which was Dr. No in 1962, by 8 years. In the films, we get this very distinctive gun barrel logo appearing in the opening sequence. And there appears to be some subliminal messaging going on here, because if you really study the swirling sort of pattern here, what you find is that you've got an expression of 666, that number that just doesn't seem to go away and crops up in my work all the time. It's very similar to the way we see 666 cleverly encoded into the Google corporate logo. And this is a more modern rendering of that gun barrel sequence, where you have a would-be assassin stalking Bond as he walks across the scene, and then Bond quickly turns and fires a shot, and you see the blood coming down. But with a little bit of imagination here, could that be some sort of reptilian eye, do you think? Bit of similarity there. Maybe there's some subliminal programming going on there as well. So I mentioned the Bond women. They appear in every story, and there could be more to this than meets the eye, especially when you factor in the work of this author and researcher, Philip Gardner, who put out a book called The Bond Code, The Dark World of Ian Fleming and James Bond. And what he's talking about in this book is Ian Fleming being an alchemist, being schooled in the occult art of alchemy. And Gardner points out that in every story, when Bond encounters one of these dastardly villains, he's only able to overcome the villain when he joins forces with one of these women, the Bond girls. So it's like a fusing of the sacred feminine and masculine energies, which when they come together, perform that kind of alchemical cycle, which results in the defeat of evil, which is a very interesting analogy for these stories and a very different slant to put on them. I feel we're getting a lot of truth in the James Bond films about the way society is really structured and what really goes on. So there was this organization known as Spectre, and it sort of morphed in the James Bond novels out of SMERSH. SMERSH was a Russian military intelligence arm. It was comprised of two Russian words, Smert Spionum, which means death to spies. So Bond first found himself up against SMERSH agents, and then later in the series, starting with the story Thunderball, Fleming introduced a new criminal organization known as Spectre, which stood for the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion, aka the government. And so the operatives of Spectre would sit around a table and plot the downfall of humanity and come up with their latest scheme, their latest plan to gain power and gain a tactical advantage over the governments of the world. This, to me, seems very similar to what we hear about groups such as Bilderberg, beginning in 1954 with this particular meeting, and so many other organizations that have come along in the wake of it, like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Round Table, the Club of Rome, all these different groups. They all seem to get together and plot what the next changes to society are going to be. Who knows what this year's meeting's involved in terms of what's yet to roll out. But I think the Bond films were letting us know that this kind of dynamic really takes place in society, and they're making out that it's these shadowy criminal organizations that are operating in the shadows, whereas in fact it's groups such as this which are really plotting these kind of agendas, which end up affecting us all. Head of Spectre was the archetypal Bond villain, Ernst Stavro Blofeld. And you have to wonder whether there are aspects of Blofeld's character which also reflected Fleming's, because in the books, Fleming gave Blofeld the very same birth date as himself, 28th of May, 1908. So Blofeld's been portrayed by various different actors over the years. He first appeared in From Russia with Love, but you didn't see his face. You just saw his hand stroking the white cat on his lap. White cats, I'm told, are supposed to symbolize the spirits of wizards from the afterlife, the spirit world, that come back into manifestation as white cats. That's one interpretation that I've heard. So then the first time you see Blofeld's face is when he's portrayed by Donald Pleasance in You Only Live Twice in 1967. And from that point on, he became much parodied, such as in, the Mike Myers, Austin Powers films as Dr. Evil. And, you know, this is the original Blofeld, and this is the one we have today. Brand new Dr. Evil, right? Complete with the comedy accent. Telly Savalas had a go at playing Blofeld on Her Majesty's. And then the aforementioned Charles Gray portrayed Blofeld in a very different way in the film Diamonds Are Forever. Interestingly, in this movie, Blofeld is creating doubles of himself to throw his enemies off track. And so we get dynamics such as radical appearance modification, which comes out of Intel circles. It's where somebody is given a complete makeover with plastic surgery and such to completely change their appearance. So Blofeld's interested in that, and in this movie he's created clones of himself so that he can be in different places at once. Where have I heard that dynamic expressed recently? In On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Blofeld is interested in heraldry and also ancestry. So a big part of this story's narrative involves Blofeld trying to establish himself as the rightful Count de Beauchamp, going back into ancestral genealogy. And this reflects the importance of bloodline families to the establishment and everything that they do. This, again, comes through my research into the music industry, and it's the key to why so many famous people, celebrities, world leaders, so-called, are selected for these roles. It comes down to the genealogy and the ancestry reflected by the families that they come out of. And Blofeld is interested in that in this story. He wants to trace his ancestry, and this is a key to so much of what goes on. And it's another truth that we got expressed through the James Bond stories. So also in this movie, which starred George Lazenby, an Australian actor, it was his only role as Bond, and he got absolutely slated by the critics at the time. I think he did a half-decent job, to be honest, considering that he wasn't actually an actor before he went into this film. In interviews, he said he blagged it. Sean Connery had left the series, the producers were looking for a new James Bond, he turned up to the audition, and he lied about having had acting experience, totally bluffing it, and the producers believed him and said, okay, you're hired. And then he was like, oh shit, what do I do now? So he gave it his best shot, and I think it turned out okay. But in this movie, we've got a glimpse into the world of mind control, and specifically hypnosis, and other elements of it, such as neuro-linguistic programming. So Bond finds himself at this clinic in the Swiss Alps, where Blofeld is supposedly working on different scientific techniques, but what's actually happening is he's recruited a bevy of young beauties from all over the world, these young women, and at night he's putting them into a hypnotic trance through messages broadcast over the PA system in the clinic. And through the clever use of NLP and the words that he's using, the trigger words, the trigger phrases, he's putting them into a mind-controlled trance and supplanting subliminal messages into their minds. And he's actually grooming them to become assassins, to go back to their own countries and unleash a deadly virus, would you believe? Not the only time we've had that expressed through the James Bond stories. In Moonraker, we find Roger Moore's James Bond creeping into a secret laboratory in Venice where they're cooking up some sort of bioweapon, and we see one of the scientists accidentally knocking over a test tube of this substance, and all the scientists in the lab suddenly die horribly. So I think we were being prepared for something else that was known to be coming through that. And we got another expression of it through the latest James Bond film, No Time to Die. We'll come back to it briefly in due course, but the villain of this movie, Rami Malek, has also developed some sort of bio-weapon which he plans to unleash around the world, and this one targets specific DNA types. And I wonder, could this be the reason why this movie was delayed from release for so long? Because it was originally due to be put out in April 2020. Was anything happening in the world in April 2020 that you can remember of any importance? So the movie was put back to October 2020, And then it was put back all the way to October 2021. So by the time we eventually got to see it, it had been completed for at least 2 years. And I think one of the main reasons for its delay was because of the plot involving a bioweapon targeting specific DNA types being a little too close to what we were being told in mainstream society was going on all over the place. Different aspects of mind control and trauma and torture have been depicted in the Bond stories. In the very first movie, Dr. No, in 1962, we find that the villain of the title has imprisoned Bond in this cell, and the only way he can escape is to go through this tunnel system where he undergoes various challenges. And we've got this sort of spiral design happening in the foreground there, which again is a mind control trigger. It's another visual trigger for trauma-based mind control when you get into all that. Different kind of torture going on in Casino Royale, Daniel Craig's first outing, where he's getting his genitals brutally whipped by the villain Le Chiffre. This is a scene that comes out of the original novel, Casino Royale. And Fleming's novels were criticised at the time for being too violent and just too sadistic. But that does seem to have been an aspect of Fleming's character, which came through in these stories. A different kind of torture went on in the movie Skyfall, where the villain, Javier Bardem, is psychologically torturing Bond. He's basically seducing him. And he says to him at one point, "I bet your training didn't prepare you for a scenario such as this." So it kind of reflects the times that we'd moved into by the time we got that movie. But going all the way back to the novel, The Man with the Golden Gun, which was the first one released after Fleming's death in 1964, we find in the early scenes, Bond, who's been missing for several months since the end of the previous story, You Only Live Twice, turns up unexpectedly in the office of his boss, M, and he takes out a gun and tries to shoot him. And it turns out that Bond has been imprisoned by the Russians, and he's supposed to have undergone mind control programming of the Manchurian Candidate type, where he's been brainwashed and conditioned to try and kill M. And the attempt fails, and then Bond has to go into the lab to be de-brainwashed, effectively, to undo the programming. But we've got a glimpse there into the world, the very real world of MKUltra mind control, which Fleming must have known about. And that program was in full flow in the 1960s. Two of the Roger Moore movies, The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, feature two villains who are quite similar. They're even doing the same hand signals. But you had Stromberg in The Spy Who Loved Me, who had dreams of establishing an underwater civilization and then destroying the rest of humanity. So only his utopian futuristic society would survive. And then Hugo Drax dreamed of doing basically the same thing in outer space, establishing a colony out there and destroying the Earth. Both these screenplays were written by Christopher Wood, so he seemed to be a bit lacking in imagination by the time of the second story. But both these villains talked about population reduction, eugenics. They were eugenicists. So here we get a glimpse into the real-life mindset of the likes of Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, and all the rest of them. And of course, what was, until a couple of weeks ago, inscribed on the Georgia Guidestones, this wish list for what the so-called elites wanted to achieve. And of course, they've now been destroyed, along with the evidence of what they said they wanted. And I wonder whether their destruction was a deliberate act of destroying all evidence of what was in place, and whether they were chosen to be destroyed because the so-called elites feel that this program is now underway. So they don't have to express their wish and their intent for it anymore and hope for it to manifest because they feel the job is already done. Just a thought on that one. The manipulation of the mainstream media and the headlines came up in a James Bond story as well. Tomorrow Never Dies, featuring Jonathan Pryce as a media baron, sort of modelled in the image of Rupert Murdoch or Robert Maxwell before him. And basically, he, through his criminal enterprise, creates events so that his media operations can report on them and then give a skewed version of the facts and use it to do things like start wars, for example. You know, such as happens every day in the real world. And a very bizarre scene that we got in the movie Diamonds Are Forever for no apparent reason. This was 1971 when the Apollo non-moon missions were underway. And so we find Bond in this underground facility in the middle of the Nevada desert. Area 51, anyone? And he's escaping from the villains, and he finds himself on this film set where they're filming a fake moon landing. What could possibly be getting conveyed here, I wonder? So this was in 71, so the Apollo non-moon mission was well underway by this point, and the general public was being conditioned to believe that men had actually walked on the moon, you know, that disk of light that we see in the sky that you can't land a rocket on, but that's another matter. And so Bond is running across this film set, and you've got these astronauts, and they're walking in slow motion as if they're in zero gravity on the moon, but Bond is running across the scene at full speed. And then they send a bunch of cars across the film set to try and catch him. So that's a very bizarre one, but it's all about mind control and conditioning and subliminal programming. So I think we were getting sent a message here, but very few people would have interpreted it for what it was really intended to convey at the time, I feel. The world of the occult came up in the story Live and Let Die, both the novel and the film. We had the figure Solitaire, who was a tarot reader, and she was divining future events, such as Bond's arrival. Also in that film, we had Baron Samedi, and this was going into the voodoo religious system. And he's representing duality here, the polarity between night and day and good and evil. And at the very end of the movie, you think Baron Samedi has died, because in a previous scene, he's been knocked into a coffin full of snakes, and the lid shuts, and you assume that's the end of him. But you see him riding the end of a train at the very end of the movie, showing that he's not died after all. So we have the only real glimpse into occult belief systems and supernatural belief systems in all of the Bond stories through this particular adventure. Now, I can't do this presentation on strange elements of James Bond without bringing in what appears to be an expression of the so-called Mandela effect. So many of you are probably familiar with this one. But in the movie Moonraker, Jaws, the villain's henchman, here he is, portrayed by Richard Keel, gets the most unlikely of girlfriends. It's this young girl whose name is Dolly. She's got the glasses and the pigtail there. And I recall, from having seen this movie in 1979, a very distinctive feature about her. Does anyone remember what it is? Okay. How many of you would say that you remember seeing this film and you remember seeing Dolly with braces on her teeth? Okay, not as many as I expected. Right. Well, I clearly remember it, but now they've disappeared. And this, to me, is the example of this phenomenon that convinces me that there's something to it. So, any copy that you now see of Moonraker, you'll find Dolly with perfect white teeth and no braces. And I even went to the length of ordering myself a VHS video copy because I was so convinced that this scene had been digitally manipulated. So I thought, oh, I'll prove this. I'll just get an old video copy and the braces will be there. They're gone. So something very strange is happening here. The whole idea of that scene was that Jaws has these metal teeth, a dental imperfection. And the thing that attracts him to Dolly is the fact that when she smiles at him, she's got braces on her teeth, another dental imperfection. So that's what causes the attraction between them. Now it's gone, but with the so-called Mandela effect, there is what's known as residue, which is aspects of the original expression that seem to have survived, even though the original example seems to have gone. So we've got some notes here from the film set of Moonraker, and it describes the various characters and tells you something about them. And in this entry for Dolly, it says it's a young blonde girl with pigtails, glasses, and braces. But then you have the actress Blanche Ravellech, who's French, and she was asked in this online discussion on Facebook whether her character of Dolly ever wore braces. I don't know how many of you are hot on French. I believe that in French, she's being asked, did your character ever have braces? And she's saying, no, she never did. Perhaps any French speakers could confirm that. Okay. So it's all very strange. That's how I remember it. Could my memory be flawed? Possibly. But anyone that studied the so-called Mandela effect will know that many people around the world insist that they remember certain things in a particular way, and that now seems to have changed. I think there's something going on here. Interesting that it would crop up in James Bond stories. So the films very much reflected the times in which they were released. So the early Sean Connery films, From Russia with Love, in my opinion, is the very best James Bond film. It's a good old-fashioned spy thriller that just stands on its own. And it was a product of that era, that Cold War era, talking about espionage and the mistrust and all of this paranoia that was around at the time. And it worked very well within that context. In 1967, we had a very bizarre film, which wasn't a part of the main canon of work that came from the producers, Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman. This was the original Casino Royale, which was produced by a guy named Charles K. Feldman. And he'd got the rights to the very first Ian Fleming story, but just that one alone. And he wanted to make a movie out of it. He saw how successful the original James Bond movies were, so he decided to make this one a comedy spoof. And so we had David Niven portraying James Bond, and Peter Sellers takes the role for part of the film as well. But this one is very psychedelic because it came out in 1967, the summer of love. So there was LSD everywhere. There were all these changes to society, the counterculture, the hippie flower power era that I've spoken about in other talks. And this film very much represented that. Then by the time Daniel Craig comes along, the films have changed in tone. They're very different to the Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan films. Those actors pretty much played the role for jokes and quips and one-liners, but there was none of that with Daniel Craig. He was much more serious, much more brooding, and those films were much darker. We saw the destruction of MI6 headquarters in one of the films, which seems to be symbolic of the destruction of the old guard, the old school, the old way of doing things. It was announcing that we're in a new era now. We had a female M, played by Judi Dench, based on the real-life MI6 chief, Stella Rimington. And then Bond's gadgets and technology had changed as well. In the old-school films, such as Goldfinger here, you had the original Q that would give Bond all his gadgetry, like exploding pens and trackers in his shoe and all this sort of thing. And by the time Daniel Craig's era had come along, that technology had got much more sinister. So in this film, Q is injecting him with what is said to be smart blood. And this is a method of tracking Bond so that his employers know where he is at any given time, anywhere in the world. There's no escaping from it because it's become part of his biological system. And this, of course, ties into what we're told about incoming biometric digital IDs. If we collectively allow it to happen, we won't, but that's the plan. And those plans were being pre-announced in this film. So No Time to Die is the latest James Bond film, and I'm sorry for any of you that haven't seen it yet, this is where the spoilers come. They can't be avoided. So, in this film, eventually released at the end of 2021, I was very bemused, because I didn't know what was coming, to first of all see the death of Felix Leiter, the CIA agent, who'd been Bond's ally for so many adventures. I thought, what the hell are they doing? They're killing off Felix Leiter. Then they kill off Blofeld, the archetypal Bond villain. I'm like, no, they can't kill Blofeld as well. And then, major spoiler, they kill off James Bond as well. James Bond seemingly dies at the end of this film. And this just reflects the dark, sort of nihilistic nature of the Daniel Craig era. In the same way as characters like Batman and Superman and Doctor Who have got more dark and they're pushing agendas and stuff. So it is with James Bond. The James Bond we get in No Time to Die is very different to the James Bond we saw in Dr. No at the very beginning of the series. And so it's very much reflecting the mood of these times. So, ending up, I always end my music industry talks by pointing out that the information that I present is obviously very dark and devastating in nature. And it brings me no joy to present this stuff, because whereas I used to piss people off by exposing the true nature of their musical heroes, now I've moved on to films. I'll be doing TV series next. But in all seriousness, although it's very unsettling to discover this stuff and to realize that actually these films were full of mind control and conditioning all along, it's also very liberating, because we're a very privileged generation. We're the first generation that's been able to get a grasp on this kind of information to actually discover this stuff. You know, in the vast overwhelming majority of cases through the internet, what's available to us through the internet. And so we can now discover this truth, and we can know what's been lying in plain sight all this time. And that can be a very empowering thing, and we have to see it that way, because we're putting all these different pieces of the puzzle together now. We're discovering how music has been used, how movies have been used, how popular culture is used to push social engineering agendas. We're discovering all this information about so-called health and so-called medicine and so-called science and the political machinations and all these other aspects of our lives. And we're discovering the extent to which we've been lied to. Deception is everywhere. Duplicity is everywhere. And who knew that all this stuff also lies embedded in James Bond movies? But it does, and we can comprehend this, and we can apply it, and we can resolve to never be fooled in the same way again. The expression, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, is very meaningful. You're supposed to learn from these mistakes. You're not supposed to fall for the same tricks over and over again. And when you get a magician or an illusionist, such as Derren Brown, who I always give as the example, who will occasionally spill the beans on how he pulled off a particular trick, a seemingly impossible illusion, he'll show you how he did it. And when he does, you go, oh yeah, I see it now. The next time you see that illusion performed, you're not going to be fooled in the same way, because now the conscious mind has been engaged. So that's why I do this work, and I hope that this expose of this character of James Bond, very much a part of the British institution and British way of life, has shed some light on that whole dynamic. How am I doing for time? I've got 5 minutes. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. I think we could do a couple of quick questions, if we have any.
We have a gentleman over there, sorry. Helen will come to you with the microphone, bear with us.
Hi, Mark. Do you give any credence to the gemstone file?
I don't actually know what that is, sorry.
Well, it's that concealed in Bond, and particularly Diamonds Are Forever, is various information relating to the kidnap and subsequent murder of Howard Hughes and the Kennedy assassination, that Willard White, WW, is a substitute for Howard Hughes, and it's a whole web spins out from there, pal. And of course, the fake moon landing being directed by Stanley Kubrick and inserted into Diamonds Are Forever for obvious reasons.
Absolutely, yeah. I was aware that the character of Willard White was based on Howard Hughes, but I didn't know about those other connections, so thanks for bringing those to my attention.
Another
Any
question?
more?
Jason Bourne.
American James Bond.
Jason Bourne took over the role of the Bond movies as advertised on the DVDs or the films of that genre of films, Threatstone, Super Soldiers, Jason Bourne.
Yeah, very
I
much
think
an
there's
American version
four
of
movies,
James Bond.
4 movies on that.
Yep. It's the CIA substituting for British military intelligence, and lots of glimpses into MK Ultra there, and the kind of programming that goes on and is very real, and that was put out there in the character of Jason Bourne.
And likewise, the Gentleman, the Kingsman movies.
Yeah, the Colin
With CIA taking over that.
Yeah, Taron Egerton, yeah. God, I hated those movies. Terrible. Lots of programming in there.
I've got a question, Mark. I did read the books a long time ago when I was 13, I think. The underground bases where the villains live and the underground bases mythology now. Were those underground bases in the actual books at the time? I can't remember.
No, they were pretty much a product of the films.
Yeah.
You know, Flemming had his villains hiding out in on islands, you know, secret islands in various places. But in terms of underground bases, they were created by the screenwriters of the films.
The franchise thought that was important to put in. Good. Thanks.
Exactly. And we hear so much about underground bases, DOMs and such. And we get that again in Diamonds Are Forever. That's a very revelatory film. We've heard about some different aspects of it. We also had this underground villain's lair, which was very much modelled on Area 51, one of the deep underground military bases. So the question arises, just how much did the screenwriters of these films know about stuff that really goes on?
How are we doing? One more question. Coming round to you.
Thank you. I was wondering, in your opinion, what would be the reason for hinting that something like the moon landings were faked when so much money, so much time has been put into the narrative that we went to the moon and stuff like that, and similar things in other movies and TV shows where they hint at truth? What would be your opinion of hinting at the truth rather than maintaining the narrative they've worked so hard to tell?
Well, I feel this ties into the occultist's favourite dynamic of placing the truth in plain sight. And I get into this big time in my music industry research. So they will tell you the truth of a matter, so they'll let you know that the moon landings were faked, but they do it in a cryptic, encoded sort of form. So they put it in a comedy sequence in a James Bond film, so that nobody really knows that that's what's being communicated. But as far as they're concerned, they've absolved themselves of the karmic responsibility that would ordinarily come down on them, because they've communicated it to us and they've given us an opportunity to know. Of course, nobody could be reasonably expected in 1971 to know that's what's going on. These days, more and more people would be able to spot it because we're able to do that kind of research. But back then, you couldn't. But as far as they're concerned, they've given the public an opportunity to know that this whole thing was a hoax. And that's why they do this stuff all the time. I did want to mention, actually, that my books are available in the bookstore at the back, if you'll excuse a shameless plug. This is all my music industry stuff, which I've not spoken about today, but my 3 musical truth books, as well as my allegorical novel, The Cause and the Cure, are available there. And it's been very interesting to give a different talk to you today and to deviate from my usual subject matter. It's been very refreshing, and I hope you found it to be stimulating as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much.